All right, let's just skip to my second part. All right. Um, Alrighty. So up to this point, I've focused on sociology and how unequal wealth distribution shapes access to housing through systems like structural inequality and stratification. But the reality is, sociology alone can't fully explain or solve the housing crisis. Each discipline explains part of the problem, but none of them explain the full picture on their own. The housing crisis is multidimensional. It's not just about inequality, it's also about how markets operate, how policies are created, and even how people think about housing in society. All these factors don't work separately, they interact and reinforce each other, which is why the problem is so persistent. To understand the housing crisis fully, we need to look at what each discipline specifically contributes to the issue. From a sociological perspective, we focus on inequality and lived experience, who is most affected by the housing crisis and why certain groups are more vulnerable than others. From an economic perspective, the focus is on how markets operate, things like supply and demand, rising home prices, and how wealth concentration influences the housing market. Political science adds another layer by looking at policy decisions, why certain housing policies exist, how they're created, and how they can later or either reduce or reinforce inequality. And finally, cultural studies helps us explain how beliefs and social norms shape the way people think about housing, like viewing housing as an investment instead of a basic necessity, or why some issues are ignored. This slide is a great visual aid to see what that looks like between the different dimensions. In order to really understand what's going on, we have to bring together multiple perspectives of the problem to see how they interact with one another. Each of these perspectives is a puzzle piece that explains a different part of the problem, and when we put them all together, we start to see a much clearer and more complete picture of the housing crisis. That way, we can come up with an effective solution to the issue. As I just talked about, when we bring these disciplines together, we can start to see how the housing crisis is not caused by one factor, but by systems working together. These factors don't operate independently, they constantly feed into one another. For example, wealth allows individuals and corporations to buy more property, which increases their control over the housing market. At the same time, policies often protect property ownership and investment, which reinforces that advantage instead of redistributing it. And culturally, housing is often seen as an investment or a way to build wealth rather than a basic human necessity. That mindset makes these systems feel normal, even when they create inequality. So instead of one problem, what we really have is a cycle where wealth, policy, and culture continuously reinforce each other and make the housing crisis more persistent. Once we understand how these systems connect, we can start thinking about solutions, but these solutions have to be interdisciplinary. From an economic perspective, expanding affordable housing is essential to making housing more accessible to lower income groups. From a political standpoint, policy reform plays a major role. Things like rent control, zoning changes, and tenant protections can help prevent displacement and reduce inequality. From a sociological perspective, we have to address the root issue of inequality itself, because as long as wealth remains concentrated, access to housing will continue to be unequal. And culturally, we need to shift how we think about housing. Instead of viewing it primarily as an investment, it needs to be recognized as a basic human necessity. But the biggest takeaway here is that solving the housing crisis isn't about small isolated fixes, it's about addressing the root of the problem. That means treating housing as a necessity, reducing wealth concentration, and increasing access to stable housing across different groups. So instead of just managing the outcomes, we have to change the system that's producing the crisis in the first place.